exposed. The only time she had balked at donning a local fashion was while she and Nynaeve traveled to Tanchico with the sea folk. But in its own way, Ebudari fashion was almost... She sighed again. She was just trying to delay. Avienda should have to come to lead her by the hand. I will not apologize, Nynaeve said suddenly at her shoulder. She clutched her own gray skirts with both hands, staring at the wandering woman as though Moghedien herself waited inside. I won't. You should have worn white, after all, Elaine murmured, earning a suspicious sideways glance. After a moment she added, You did say it was the color for funerals, which produced a satisfied nod, though it was not what she had meant at all. This would be a disaster if they could not keep peace among themselves. Brigitta had had to settle for an infusion of herbs this morning, and a particularly bitter mix at that, because Nynaeve claimed she was not angry enough to channel. She had gone on in the most dramatic manner about funeral white being the only suitable color, insisted she was not coming, until Elaine dragged her out of their apartments, and announced at least 20 times since that she would not apologize. Peace had to be
Hey,
kept,
big
but
movie fan.
you agreed to this, Nynaeve. No, I don't want to hear any more about the rest of us
Hope you're
bullying
doing
you.
well.
You agreed. So stop sulking. Nynaeve spluttered, eyes going wide with outrage. She was not to be diverted, though, despite one fiercely incredulous sulking under
I
her
just gotta
breath.
share this out real
We
quick.
need to discuss this further, Elaine. There is no need to be so hasty. There must be 1,000 reasons why this won't work, Taviran or no Taviran, and Matt Cawthon is 900 of them. Elaine gave her a level look. Did you deliberately choose the bitterest herbs that would work this morning? Wide-eyed outrage turned to wide-eyed innocence, but red stained Nynaeve's cheeks. Elaine pushed open the door. Nynaeve followed, muttering. Elaine would not have been surprised if she stuck out a tongue, too. Sulky was not even in it this morning. The smell of breads baking wafted from the kitchens, and all the shutters were open to air out the common room. A plump-cheeked serving woman standing atop a tall stool stretched on tiptoes to take down the draggled evergreen branches from above the windows, while others replaced tables and benches and
Oh, it's
chairs
all
that
good.
must have been
Big
taken
movie
away for the
fan.
dancing. This early no one else was about, except for a skinny girl in a white apron, sweeping half-heartedly with a brush broom. She might have been pretty if her mouth had not seemed set in a constant pout. There was surprisingly little mess, considering that inns were supposed to be riotous, even licentious, during festivals. A part of her wished she could have seen it, though. Could you direct me to Master Cawthon's rooms? She asked the skinny girl with a smile, proffering 2 silver pennies. Nynaeve sniffed. She was tight as the skin on a fresh apple. She had given the beggar
Hell yeah,
one
big movie
copper.
fan. Appreciate it.
The girl eyed them sullenly, and surprisingly the coins as well, and mumbled something sour that sounded like a gilded woman last night and ladies this morning. She gave directions grudgingly. For a moment Elaine thought she intended to scorn the pennies, but on the point of turning away, the girl snatched the silver from her hand without so much as a word of thanks, pausing only to tuck them into the neck of her dress of all places, before she set to swinging her broom, as if to beat the floor to death. Perhaps she had a
Hey,
pocket of stone in
Christopher. How
there.
you doing,
You
bro?
see,
Good to
Nynaeve
see
grumbled
you.
under her breath. You marked me. He tried to push his attentions on that young woman. That's the sort of man you want me to apologize to. Elaine said nothing, only led the way up the railless steps at the back of the room. If Nynaeve did not stop complaining, the first hallway on the right, the girl had said, and the last door on the left.
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien. Content de te voir.
On the left, but in front of it she hesitated, biting her lower lip.
Oh yeah.
Nynaeve brightened. You see it's a bad idea now, don't you? We aren't Aiel, Elaine. I like the girl well enough for all she's forever fondling that knife of hers, but just think of the absolute drivel she talks. It's impossible. You must know it is. We did not agree to anything impossible, Nynaeve. Keeping her voice firm took an effort. Some of what Avienda had suggested Apparently, in all seriousness, she actually had suggested letting the man switch them. What we did agree to is quite possible. Barely. She rapped loudly on the paneled door with her knuckles. There was a fish carved on the door, a round thing with stripes and a snout. All of the doors had different carvings, most of fish. There was no answer. Nynaeve puffed out a breath she must have been holding. Perhaps he has gone out. We'll just have to come back another time. At this hour? She rapped once more. You say he always lies abed when he can. Still no sound from inside. Elaine, if Brigitte is any indication, Matt got himself juicy as a fiddler last night. He won't thank us for waking him. Why don't we just go away and... Elaine lifted the latch and went in. Nynaeve followed with a sigh that could have been heard back in the palace. Matt Coffin was sprawled on his bed atop the knitted red coverlet, a folded cloth lying over his eyes and dripping onto the pillow. The room was not very tidy, despite the absence of dust. A
Oh, yeah.
boot stood on the washstand. The washstand, next to a white basin full of unused water. The stand mirror sat askew, as if he had stumbled into it and simply left it tilted back sharply, and his wrinkled coat lay tossed across a ladder-backed chair. He wore everything else, including that black scarf he seemed never to take off, and the other boot. The silver fox head dangled from his unlaced shirt. The medallion made her fingers itch. If he really was lying there sodden with drink, she might be able to remove it unfelt. One way or another, she intended to find out how the thing absorbed the power. Finding out how almost anything worked was a fascination to her, but that fox head was all the puzzles in the world rolled into one. Nynaeve caught her sleeve and jerked her head toward the door, silently mouthing, "Asleep," and something else she could not make out. Probably another plea to go. "Leave me alone, Nerim," he mumbled suddenly. "I told you before, I don't want anything but a new skull. And close the door softly or I'll pin your ears to it." Nynaeve jumped and tried to pull her toward the door, but she stood her ground. "It is not Nerim, Master Coffin." Raising his head from the pillow, he used both hands to lift the cloth a trifle and squint at them with reddened eyes. Grinning, Nynaeve made no effort at all to hide her pleasure at his wretched state. What Elaine could not understand at first was why she wanted to grin too. Her one experience with drinking too much had left her with nothing but pity and sympathy for anyone so snared. In the back of her mind, she felt Brigitte's head throbbing still, and it came to her. Certainly she could not like Brigitte drowning herself in drink, whatever the reason, but neither could she like the thought that
Oh, yeah,
anyone could
big
do
leaf
anything
hat.
at all better than
I
her
would
first
say a
order. A
PlayStation.
ridiculous thought. Embarrassing, but satisfying, too.
At least in my
"What are
opinion.
you doing here?" he demanded hoarsely, then winced and lowered his voice. "It's the middle of the night." "It's morning," Nynaeve said sharply. "Don't you remember talking with Brigitte?" "Could you not be so loud?" he whispered, closing his eyes. The next instant they popped open again. "Brigitte?" Sitting up abruptly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed. For a time he just sat there, peering at
Yeah,
the
the play's
floorboards,
pretty
elbows
good.
on his knees and the medallion
And there's
swinging
more
from its
people
thong
like
around his neck. At last he
online,
turned
or at
his
least
head
on
to look at them
YouTube, that
balefully, or perhaps his eyes just
stream
made it seem so.
PlayStation versus
"What did she tell you?"
Xbox.
"She informed us of your demands, Master Coffin," Elaine said formally. This must be how it felt to stand before the headsman's block. There was nothing for it but to keep her head high and face whatever came proudly. "I wish to thank you from my heart for rescuing me from the Stone of Tyr." There, she had begun, and it had not hurt. Not very much. Nynaeve stood there glowering, her lips growing tighter and tighter. The woman was not going to leave her to do this alone. Elaine embraced the source almost before she thought, and channeled a thin flow of air that flicked Nynaeve's earlobe like a snapping finger. The woman clapped a hand to her ear and glowered, but Elaine simply turned coolly back to Master Coffin and waited. I thank you, too, Nynaeve mumbled sullenly at last. From the heart. Elaine rolled her eyes in spite of herself. Well, he had asked them to speak more softly, and he did seem to hear. Strangely, he shrugged with embarrassment. Oh, that. It was nothing. Likely thing you'd have gotten yourself free in another tick without me. His head sank to his hands, and he pressed the damp cloth to his eyes once more. On your way out, would you
Give
ask
me 1
Tyra to
second,
bring me
please,
some wine
everyone.
punch? A
There we go.
slender girl, pretty, with a warm eye. Elaine quivered. Nothing? The man demanded an apology. She humbled herself to give it, and now it was nothing? He was not deserving of sympathy or pity. She still held Saidar, and she considered thumping him with a much thicker flow than she had used on Nynaeve. Not that that would do any good so long as he wore the fox head. Then again it hung loose, not touching him. Did it offer the same protection when it was not? Nynaeve ended her speculation by lunging for him, fingers clawed. Elaine managed to put herself between them and seize the other woman by the shoulders. For a stretched moment they stood nose to nose, except for the difference in their heights. With a grimace, Nynaeve finally relaxed, and Elaine felt it was safe to release her. The man still had his head bowed, all unaware. Whether the medallion protected him or not, she could snatch his bow stave from the corner and beat him till he howled. She felt heat rise in her face. She had stopped Nynaeve from ruining everything, only to think of ruining it herself. Worse, by the smirky, self-satisfied little smile the other woman gave her, she knew very well what had been in her head. There is more, Master Cawthon, she announced, squaring her shoulders. The smile vanished from Nynaeve's face. We also wish to apologize for delaying so long in giving you your much-deserved thanks. And we apologize, humbly, she stumbled a little on that, for the way we have treated you since. Nynaeve stretched out a beseeching hand that she ignored. To show the depth of our regret, we undertake the following promises. Avienda had said an apology was only a beginning. We will not belittle or demean you in any way, nor shout at you for any reason, nor attempt to give you orders. Nynaeve winced. Elaine's mouth tightened too, but she did not stop. Recognizing your due concern for our safety, we will not leave the palace without telling you where we are going, and we will listen to your advice. Light. She had no wish to be Aiel, no wish to do any of this, but she wanted Avienda's respect. If you decide that we are... Not that she had any intention of becoming a sister wife. The very idea was indecent, but she did like her. Are putting ourselves in needless danger. It was not Avienda's fault that Rand had caught both their hearts.
Yeah, we
And
could.
Rand's as well.
That's
We
what I
will
have
accept
is
bodyguards of your choosing.
PlayStation.
Fate or Taviran or whatever. What was, was. She loved both
And
Winterback sisters.
my brother,
And
most
keep
hated
them with us
grower,
as long as possible.
also has
Burn the man for doing this to her.
plays
It was
PlayStation.
not Matt Cawthon she meant. This I swear by the Lion Throne of Andor. She breathed in as if she had run a mile. Nynaeve wore a face like a cornered badger. His head swiveled toward them ever so slowly, and he lowered the cloth just enough to expose one red-streaked eye. You sound like you have an iron rod down your throat, my lady, he said mockingly. You have my permission to call me Matt.
It's not all that bad, though, big
Odious
movie
man.
fan.
He would not know civility if it bit him on the nose. That sanguine eye slanted toward her. What about you, Nynaeve? I heard a lot of we from her, but not a word from you. I won't shout at you, Nynaeve shouted. And all the rest, too. I promise you... She gobbled on the edge of swallowing her tongue as she realized she could not call him one of the names he warranted without breaking the promise already. And yet the effect of her shout was most gratifying. With a cry, he shuddered and dropped the cloth, clutched his head with both hands. His eyes bulged. Flaming dice, he whimpered. or something very like. It suddenly struck Elaine that he would be a very good source of pithy language. Stablemen and the like always seemed to scrape their tongues clean the moment they saw her. Of course, she had promised herself to civilize him, to make him useful to Rand, but that need not interfere too much with his language. In fact, she realized there was a good deal she had not promised not to do. Pointing that out should settle Nynaeve considerably. After a long moment, he spoke in a hollow voice. "Thank you, Nynaeve." He paused to swallow hard. "I thought you two must be somebody else in disguise there for a bit. Since I still seem to be alive, we might as well take care of the rest of it. I seem to recall that Brigitta said you wanted me to find something for you. What?" "You won't find it," Nynaeve told him in a firm voice. Well, perhaps more hard than firm, but Elaine did not think of calling her down. He merited every wince. "You will accompany us, and we will find it." "Backtracking already, Nynaeve?" Somehow he managed a derisive sneer, especially hideous with his eyes. "You just finished promising to do as I say. If you want to
Yeah,
tame
Big
Taviran on a
Moonshine, you be
leash,
safe
go
on
ask
that walk.
Rand or Perrin and see what answer you get." "We promised no such thing, Matrim Coffin," Nynaeve snapped, going up on her toes. "I promised no such thing." She looked about to fling herself at him again. Even her braids seemed to bristle. Elaine kept a better rein on her temper. They would get nowhere bludgeoning him. "We will listen to your advice and accept it, if it is reasonable, Master Matt," she chided gently. Surely he could not really believe they had promised to. Looking at him, though, she saw that he did. Oh, light. Nynaeve was right. He was going to be trouble. She held that rein firmly. Channeling again, she lifted his coat from the chair to a proper place on one of the pegs on the wall so she could sit, back straight, arranging her skirts carefully. Keeping her promises to Master Coffin, Matt, and to herself were going to be difficult, but nothing he said or did could touch her. Nynaeve eyed the only other place to sit, a low carved wooden footstool, and remained standing. One hand moved toward her braid before she folded her arms. Her foot tapped ominously. "The Atha-an-Mier call it the Bowl of the Winds, Master Matt. It is a ter'angreal." By the end, a light of excitement shone through his sickliness. "Now that would be a thing to find," he murmured. "In the Rahad." He shook his head and flinched. "I'll tell you this now. Neither of you is setting foot on the other side of the river without 4 or 5 of my red arms each. Not outside the palace, for that matter. Did Brigitta tell you about the note that was stuffed in my coat? I'm sure I told her. And there's Carden and his dark friends. You can't tell me he isn't up to something. Any sister who supports Egwene as Amerlin is in danger from the tower. Bodyguards everywhere. Light. A dangerous light shone in Nynaeve's eyes, and her foot tapped faster. "We cannot hide, Matt, and we will not. Jaikin Carden will be taken care of in due course." They had not promised to tell him everything, and they could not let him be diverted. "There are more important matters afoot." "Due course?" he began, voice rising in disbelief, but Nynaeve cut him short. 4 or 5 each?" she said sourly. "That's ridiculous." Her eyes shut for a moment, and her tone became milder. Slightly milder. "I mean to say it isn't sensible. Elaine and me, Brigitta and Avienda, you don't have that many soldiers. Anyway, all we really need is you." That last came out as though dragged. It was too much an admission.
Yeah, that's my brother.
"Brigitta and Avienda don't need minders," he said absently. "I suppose this Bowl of the Winds is more important than Caradin, but it doesn't seem right, letting dark friends walk loose." Slowly, Nynaeve's face turned purple. Elaine checked her own in the stand mirror, relieved to see she was maintaining her composure. On the outside, anyway. The man was reprehensible. Minders? She was not sure which would be worse, that he had flung that offhand insult on purpose, or that he had done so without realizing. She eyed herself in the mirror again and lowered her chin a trifle. Minders? She was poise itself. He studied them with those bloodshot eyes, but saw nothing, apparently. Was that all Brigitte told you? He asked. And Nynaeve snapped back, That was quite enough, I think, even for you. Inexplicably, he looked surprised and quite pleased. Nynaeve gave a start, then folded her arms around herself tighter. Since you're in no condition to go anywhere with us now,
I
don't
will.
scowl at
He's
me, Matt Coffin.
he's in
That
his
isn't the
room.
meaning, it's simple truth.
He's in bed
You
already.
can spend the morning moving yourself into the palace. And
I'll
you
let
didn't
him
think
know.
we'll help carry your things. I didn't promise to be a pack horse. The wandering woman is plenty good enough, he began angrily, then stopped, a wondering expression spreading over his face. A horrified expression, Elaine would have said. That should teach him to growl when he had a head like a melon. At least that was what hers had felt like the time she drank too much. Of course he would not learn from it. Men kept sticking their hands in the fire, thinking this time it would not burn, so Leanie always said. You can hardly expect we'll find the bull the first time we try, Nynaeve went on.
Nice.
Taviran or no. Going out each day will be much simpler if you don't have to come across the square. If they did not have to wait for him every morning, was what she meant. According to her, drunkenness was not the only excuse he could find for lying in bed till all hours, far from it. Besides, Elaine added, that way you can keep an eye on us. Nynaeve made a sound in her throat, very close to a groan. Did she not see that he must be enticed? It was not as if she had promised to actually allow him to keep an eye on them. He seemed not to have heard her or Nynaeve. Haggard eyes stared right through her. Why did they bloody well have to stop now? He moaned, so softly she barely heard. What under the light do you mean by
Appreciate
that?
it, Christopher.
The rooms are fit for a king, Master Matt. Tylan herself chose them, just down from her own. She has taken a very personal interest. Matt, you wouldn't have us offend the Queen, would you? One look at his face, and Elaine hurriedly channeled to push open the window and empty the wash basin through it. If she'd ever seen a man about to lose the contents of his stomach, he was staring red-eyed at her right that minute. I don't see why you're making such a fuss, she said. Actually, she supposed she did. Some of the serving women here probably let him paw them, but she doubted many in the palace would, if any. He would not be able to drink and gamble his nights away either. Tylan surely would not allow a bad example for Beslin. We all must make sacrifices. With an effort, she stopped there, not telling him that his was small and only right, theirs monstrous and unjust, no matter what Avienda said. Nynaeve had certainly railed against any sacrifice. He put his head in his hands again, making strangled noises while his shoulders shook. He was laughing. She hefted the basin on a flow of air, considering hitting him with it. When he raised his eyes again, though, he looked outraged for some reason. Sacrifices, he snarled. If I asked you to make the same, you'd box every ear in sight and pull the roof down on my head. Could he still be drunk? She decided to ignore his frightful glare. Speaking of your head, if you would like healing, I'm sure Nynaeve would oblige. If she had ever been angry enough to channel, she was now. Nynaeve gave a small jerk and glanced at her from the corner of one eye. Of course, she said hurriedly. If you want. The color in her cheeks confirmed all of Elaine's suspicions about that morning. Gracious as ever, he sneered. You just forget my head. I do very well without eyes, said I. And then, just to confuse matters, she was sure, he added in a hesitant voice, I thank you for asking, though. Almost as if he meant it. Elaine managed not to gape. Her knowledge of men was limited to Rand and what Linny and her mother had told her. Was Rand going to be as confusing as Matt? Last thing before going, she remembered to secure a promise that he would start moving to the palace immediately. He kept his word once given, so Nynaeve had made clear, however reluctantly.
Only if I was able to have the money
one
for that.
crack, and he could find 100 ways to slip through. That she'd been all too eager to emphasize. He gave his promise with a bleak, resentful grimace, or maybe that was just his eyes again. When she set the basin down at his feet, he actually looked grateful. She would not feel sympathy. She would not. Once back in the corridor with the door to Matt's room closed, Nynaeve shook her fist at the ceiling. That man could try the patience of a stone. I'm glad he wants to cuddle with his head. Do you hear me? Glad. He will make trouble. He will. You two will make more trouble for him than he ever could. The speaker stalked down the hall toward them, a woman with a touch of gray in her hair, a strong face, and a commanding voice. She also wore a frown little short of a scowl. Despite the marriage knife hanging into her cleavage, she was too fair for an Ebudari. I couldn't believe it when Kyra told me. I doubt I've ever seen so much foolishness poured into just 2 dresses. Elaine eyed the woman up and down. Not even as a novice had she gotten used to being addressed in that tone. And who might you be, my good woman? I might be and am Satala Anan, the owner of this inn, child, was the dry reply. And with that, the woman flung open a door across the hallway, seized them each by an arm, and hustled them through so fast Elaine thought her slippers had left the floor. You seem under some misapprehension, Mistress Anan, she said coolly as the woman released them to shut the door. Nynaeve was in no mood for niceties. Holding her hand so her great serpent ring was plain, she said heatedly, Now you look here. Very pretty, the woman said, and pushed each of them so hard they found themselves sitting side by side on the bed. Elaine's eyes popped in disbelief. This Anan woman confronted them, grim-faced, fists on her hips, for all the world like a mother about to castigate her daughters. Flaunting that just shows how silly you are. That young man will dandle you on his knee, 1 on each, I shouldn't wonder if you allow. He'll take a few kisses, and as much else as you're willing to give, but he won't harm you. You can harm him, though, if you keep on with this. Harm him? The woman thought she thought he had dandled. She thought... Elaine did not know whether to laugh or cry, but she stood up, straightening her skirts. As I said, Mistress Anan, you are under a misapprehension. Her voice became smoother as she went on, confusion giving way to calm. I am Elaine Trakand, daughter heir of Andor and Aes Sedai of the Green Adja. I don't know what you think... Her eyes nearly crossed as Mistress Anan pushed a finger to the tip of her nose. Elaine, if that is your name, all that keeps me from dragging you down to the kitchen and washing your mouth out, yours and that other foolish girl's there, is the possibility that you actually can channel somewhat. Or are you silly enough to wear that ring when you can't even do that? I warn you it will make no difference to the sisters over in the Tarasin Palace. Do you even know about them? If you do, frankly, you are not foolish, you're blind, stupid. Elaine's temper grew by the word. Foolish girl? Blind? Stupid? She would not put up with it, especially not right after being forced to crawl to Matt Coffin. Dandle? Matt Coffin? She maintained her outward composure, though, but not so Nynaeve. She glared in a fury, and the glow of Saidar enveloped her as she bounded to her feet. Flows of air wrapped Mistress Anan from shoulders to ankles, crushing her skirts and petticoats against her legs, just short of tight enough to topple her. I happen to be one of those sisters in the palace, Nynaeve Almira of the Yellow Adja to be exact. Now, would you like me to carry you down to the kitchens? I know something of how to wash out a mouth. Elaine stepped away from the innkeeper's outstretched arm. The woman had to feel the pressure of the flows, and even a half-wit would have known what those invisible bonds must be, yet she did not blink. Her green-flecked eyes narrowed no more. So one of you can channel at least, she said calmly. I should let you drag me downstairs, child. Whatever you do to me, you would be in the hands of real Aes Sedai by noon, I'll wager that. Didn't you hear me? Nynaeve demanded. The Anan woman did not even pause. You'll not only spend the next year blubbering, you will do part of it in front of anyone you told that you were Aes Sedai. Be sure they'll make you tell. They will turn your liver to water. I should let you go blundering on your way, or else run across the palace as soon as you loose me. The only reason I don't is that they'll make an example of Lord Matt nearly as much as of you, if they even suspect he's helped you. And as I said, I like the young man. I'm telling you, Nynaeve tried again, but still the innkeeper gave her no chance to tell anything. Tied like a bundle, the woman was a boulder rolling downhill. She was the whole hillside falling, flattening whatever lay in its path. Trying to keep up the lie does no good, Nynaeve. You must be, 21, give or take a year, so you might be as much as 10 years older if you've already reached the slowing. You might even have worn the shawl 4 or 5 years, except for one thing. Her head, the only part of her she could move, swiveled toward Elaine. You, child, aren't old enough to have slowed yet, and no woman has ever worn the shawl as young as you. Never in the history of the Tower. If you ever were in the Tower, I'll wager you wore white and squeaked every time the Mistress of Novices glanced your way. You had some goldsmith make that ring for you. There are some, fool enough, I hear. Or maybe Nynaeve stole it for you if she has any right to hers. Either way, since you can't be a sister, neither can she. No Aes Sedai would travel with a woman who was pretending. Elaine frowned, not noticing that she was chewing her lower lip. Slowing. How did an innkeeper in Ebu Dar know those words? Maybe Satala Anan had gone to the tower as a girl, though she would not have remained long, since she clearly could not channel. Elaine would have known even if her ability had been as small as her own mother's, and Morgase Trakand had had an ability so small she would have been sent away in a matter of weeks, probably, had she not then been daughter heir. Release her, Nynaeve, she said, smiling. She truly did feel more well-disposed toward the woman now. It must have been terrible to make that journey to Tar Valon, only to be turned away. There was no reason the woman had to believe them. Something tickled at that, but she could not say what. No reason at all. But if she had made the trip to Tar Valon, maybe she would walk across the Mulhara. Marililla or any of the other sisters could set her straight. Release her? Nynaeve yelped. Elaine! Release her. Mistress Anan, I see the only way to convince you is the Amerlin's seat and 3 sitters couldn't convince me, child. Light, did she ever let anyone finish a sentence? Now, I don't have time for any more games. I can help the pair of you. I know those who can anyway, some women who take in strays. You can thank Lord Matt that I'm willing to take you to them, but I must know. Were you ever in the Tower, or are you Wilders? If you were there, were you put out, or did you run away? The truth. They handle each in a different way. Elaine shrugged. They had done what they came for. She was more than ready to stop wasting time and get on with what needed doing next. If you won't be convinced, then that's all there is to it. Nynaeve, it is past time we were on our way. The flows around the innkeeper vanished, and the glow around Nynaeve, too. But Nynaeve stood there watching the woman warily, hopefully. She wet her lips. You know a group of women who can help us? Nynaeve, Elaine said. We don't need any help. We are Aes Sedai, remember? With a wry glance in her direction, Mistress Anan gave her skirts a shake to straighten them, and bent to smooth her exposed petticoats. Her real attention was on Nynaeve. Elaine had never felt so completely shunted aside in her life. I know a few women who take in the occasional wilder or runaway, or woman who failed her test for accepted or the shawl. There must be at least 50 of them altogether, though the number changes. They can help you find a life without the risk of a real sister making you wish she'd just skin you and be done. Now don't lie to me. Were you ever in the Tower? If you've run away, you might as well decide to go back. The Tower managed to find most runaways even during the War of the 100 Years, so you needn't think this little bother now will stop them. In truth, my suggestion then would be to go across the square and throw yourself on a sister's mercy. It will be a small mercy, I'm afraid, but you can believe me, it's more than you'll find if they have to drag you back. You won't even think of so much as leaving the tower grounds without permission after that." Nynaeve drew a deep breath. "We were told to leave the tower, Mistress Annan. I will swear to that, however you ask." Elaine stared in disbelief. "Nynaeve, what are you saying? Mistress Annan, we are Aes Sedai." The Annan woman laughed. "Child, let me talk with Nynaeve, who at least seems old enough to have sense. You tell the Circle that, and they will not take it kindly. They won't care you can channel. They can too. And they'll smack your bottom or toss you out in the street on your nose if you play the fool." "Who is this Circle?" Elaine demanded. "We are Aes Sedai. You come across to the Tarasin Palace and you will see." "I'll keep her in hand," Nynaeve had the gall to say, all the while frowning and grimacing at Elaine, as if she were the one who had gone mad. The Annan woman merely nodded. "Good. Now take off those rings and put them away. The Circle doesn't allow that sort of pretending. They'll have them melted down to give you a start. Though by the look of your dresses, you have coin. If you stole it, don't let Rihanna know. One of the first rules you'll have to learn is don't steal even if you are starving. They don't want to draw attention." Elaine made a fist and thrust it behind her back, and watched Nynaeve meekly slip her ring off and tuck it into her belt pouch. Nynaeve, who howled every time Marililla or Adelius or any of them forgot she was a full sister. "Trust me, Elaine," Nynaeve said. Which Elaine would have had an easier time of if she had any notion what the woman was up to. Still, she did trust her, mostly. "A small sacrifice," she muttered. Aes Sedai did go without their rings when the need arose, and she had too while passing for a sister. But it was hers by right now. Removing that band of gold almost hurt physically. "Talk to your friend, child," the Anan woman told Nynaeve impatiently. "Rihanna Corley won't put up with all this sulky pouting, and if you make me waste my morning for nothing. Come along, come along. It's lucky for you I like Lord Matt." Elaine held on to cool composure by a fingernail. Sulky pouting? Sulky pouting? When she had the chance, she was going to kick Nynaeve where it hurt. Chapter 23. Next Door to a Weaver. Nynaeve did want to talk to Elaine away from the innkeeper's ears, but she did not find the chance right away. The woman marched them out of the room, doing a fine imitation of a guard on prisoners, her stony impatience undented by the wary look she cast at Matt's door. At the back of the inn, a set of unrailed stone steps led down into a large hot kitchen full of baking smells, where the roundest woman Nynaeve had ever seen was wielding a large wooden spoon like a scepter, directing three others in sliding crusty brown loaves from the ovens and replacing them with rolls of pale dough. A large pot of the coarse white porridge that was eaten for breakfast hereabout bubbled gently on one of the white-tiled stoves. "Enid," Mistress Annan addressed the round woman, "I'm going out for a little while. I need to take these two children to someone who has time to mother them properly." Wiping broad, floury hands on a piece of white toweling, Enid studied Nynaeve and Elaine disapprovingly. Everything about her was round, her sweaty olive-skinned face, her dark eyes, all of her. She seemed made of very large balls stuffed into a dress. The marriage knife she wore hanging outside her snowy apron sparkled with a full dozen stones. "Is this the pair of barkers Kyra was chattering about, mistress? Fancy bits for the young lord's taste, I'd have said. He likes them with a bit of wiggle." That amused her by her tone. The
Hey,
innkeeper shook her
Oscar.
head in vexation.
I'm
"I
getting
told
to
that
that
girl
part.
to hold her tongue. I won't let that sort of rumor touch the wandering woman. Remind Kyra for me, Enid, and use your spoon to get her attention if need
Excuse
be."
me. Ugh.
The gaze she turned on Nynaeve and Elaine was so disparaging that Nynaeve nearly gasped. Would anyone with half their wits believe these two were Aes Sedai? Spent all their coin on dresses to impress the man, and now they'd starve unless they smile for him. Aes Sedai. Giving Enid no chance to answer, she seized Nynaeve's ear with her right hand, Elaine's with her left, and in 3 quick steps had them out into the stable yard. That was as long as Nynaeve's shock held. Then she pulled free, or tried to, because the woman let go at the same instant, and she stumbled half a dozen paces, glaring indignantly. She had not bargained for being dragged
Oh
about.
shit.
Elaine's chin rose, her
I got
blue eyes
some
so cold
roaches
Nynaeve would not
loaded
have
up
been
right now.
surprised to see frost forming in her curls. Hands on her hips, Mistress
I got
Anand
roaches
seemed
loaded
not
up,
to
but
notice. Or perhaps she simply did not care. I can hope no one in there believes
I got some
Kyra after
wax
that,
too,
she
so
said
I can't
calmly.
complain too much.
If I could have been sure you had the wits to keep your mouths shut, I'd have said and done more and made certain. She was calm, but not at all pleasant or soft. They had troubled her morning. Now follow me and don't get lost. Or if you do, do not show your faces anywhere near my inn again, or I'll send somebody to the palace to tell Marililla and Teslin. They are 2 of the real sisters, and they'll probably rip you each down the middle and share you out. Elaine shifted her gaze from the innkeeper to Nynaeve. Not a glare or a frown, yet a very meaning look just the same. Nynaeve wondered whether she was going to be able to go through with this. The thought of Matt convinced her. Any chance was better than that. We won't lose ourselves, Mistress Anand, she said, striving for meekness. She thought she did fairly well, considering how foreign meekness was to her. Thank you for helping us. Smiling at the innkeeper, she did her best to ignore Elaine, whose stare became more meaningful, hard as that was to credit. Looks or no looks,
I got
she had
wax
to make
and I
sure
got
the
my
woman continued to think them worth the
my
trouble.
pins too.
We are truly grateful, Mistress Anand. Mistress Anand eyed her askance, then sniffed and shook her head. When this was done, Nynaeve decided she was going to drag the innkeeper to the palace if need be, and make the other sisters acknowledge her in Mistress Anand's presence. This Saturday, the stable yard was empty, save for a lone boy of 10 or 12 with a bucket and a sieve, who sprinkled water striking the hard packed ground against dust. The white-plastered stable's doors were wide open, and a barrow sat in front with a dung fork resting across it. Sounds like a huge frog being stepped on floated out. Nynaeve decided it was a man.
Here
Would they have to ride to
if you
reach
go
their destination?
to the
Even a short
dispensary,
journey
you
would
could
not
be
be
paying
pleasant.
about
Walking
that
only
much
across the
to 50
square and
bucks
meaning
for a
to be
gram.
back before the sun rose very
Sometimes
high,
80 a
they
gram,
had
but
brought neither hats nor
if you
parasols
go
nor hooded cloaks. Mr. Sanan led them through the stable yard, however, down a narrow alleyway between the stable and a high wall that had
other
bedraggled
places to get it,
trees poking above the top. Someone's garden, no doubt.
then you can usually get
A
it
small
from
gate at the end let into a dusty alley,
about $10
so
a gram of
cramped
wax.
Dawn had not completely reached it yet. You children keep up now, mind you, the innkeeper told them, starting away down the dim alley. You lose yourselves, and I vow I'll go to the palace myself. Nynaeve took a grip on her braid with both hands as she followed to keep them from the Anan woman's throat. How she yearned for her first gray hair. First the other Aes Sedai, then the street folk. Light she did not want to think
And
about
then I
them. And now an innkeeper. No one took you seriously unless you had at least a little gray. Even an Aes Sedai's aged face could not possibly do it without her estimation. Elaine was lifting her skirts out the dust, though their slippers still kicked up little puffs that settled on the hems of their dresses. Let me see, Elaine said
3.5 gram
softly, looking
ones.
straight ahead. Softly, but coolly. Very coolly, in fact. She had a way of slashing someone to tatters without letting her tone heat that Nynaeve admired, usually. Now it just made her want to box the other woman's ears. We could be back in the palace, drinking blueberry tea and enjoying the breezes, while we waited for Master Cawthon to move his belongings. Perhaps Avienda and Brigitte might return with something useful. We could finally be settling exactly what to do with the man.
Turn this
Do we
one
simply
on.
follow him along the
It
streets
has
of the
a
Rahat
nice
and see
little
what
screen.
happens, or take him into buildings that look likely, or let him choose? There must be 100 worthwhile uses for this morning, including deciding whether it's safe to go back to Egwene, ever, after that bargain the sea folk wrung out of us. We have to talk about that sooner or later. Ignoring it won't help. Instead, we are off on a walk of who knows what length, squinting into the sun the whole way, if we keep on as we are, to visit women who feed runaways from the tower. Myself, I don't have much interest in catching runaways this morning or any morning, but I'm sure you can explain it, so I will understand. I do so want to understand, Nynaeve. I would hate to think I'm going to kick you the length of the Mulhara for nothing. Nynaeve's eyebrows drew down. Kick her? Elaine really was becoming violent, spending so much time with Avienda. Someone ought to slap some sense into that pair. The sun isn't high enough to make us squint yet, she muttered. It would be soon, unfortunately. Think, Elaine. 50 women who can channel, helping wilders and women put out of the tower. She felt guilty sometimes using the term wilders. In the mouths of most Aes Sedai, it was an insult, but she intended to make them speak it as a badge of pride, and she called them the Circle. That doesn't sound like a few friends to me. It sounds organized. The alley meandered between high walls and the backs of buildings, many showing bare brick through the plaster, between palace gardens and shops where an open back door revealed silversmiths, or tailors, or woodcarvers at work. Every so often Mistress Annan looked over her shoulder to make sure they still followed. Nynaeve gave her smiles and nods she hoped would convey eagerness. Nynaeve, if 2 women who could channel made a society, the tower would fall on them like a pack of wolves. How would Mistress Annan know whether they can or not anyway? Women who can and aren't Aes Sedai do not go about making a show of themselves, you know. Not for very long, anyway. In any case, I can't see it makes a difference. Egwene might want to bring every woman who can channel into the tower somehow, but that is not what we are about here. The frosty patience in Elaine's voice tightened Nynaeve's hands on her braid. How could the woman be so dense? She bared her teeth again for Mistress Annan, and managed not to scowl at the innkeeper's back when her head turned forward once more. 50 women isn't 2, Nynaeve whispered fiercely. They could channel. They must be able to. Everything hinged on that. It's beyond reason that this circle can be in the same city with a storeroom packed full of Angreal and such without at least knowing of it. And if they do, she could not keep satisfaction from honeying her voice. We'll have found the bull without Master Matrim Cawthon. We can forget those absurd promises. They were not a bribe, Nynaeve, Elaine said absently. I will keep them, and so will you if you have any honor, and I know you do. She was spending entirely too much time with Avienda. Nynaeve wished she knew why Elaine had begun thinking they all had to follow this preposterous Aiel Jeep, whatever it was. Elaine bit her underlip, frowning. All that iciness seemed to have vanished. She was herself again, apparently. Finally, she said, we would never have gone to the inn without Master Cawthon, so we'd never have met the remarkable Mistress Annan, or been taken to the circle. So if the circle does lead us to the bull, we have to say he was the root cause. Matt Cawthon. His name boiled in her head. Nynaeve stumbled over her own feet and let go of her braid to lift her skirts. The alley was hardly as smooth as a paved square, much less a palace floor. At times, Elaine in a taking was better than Elaine thinking clearly. Remarkable, she muttered. I'll remarkable her till her eyes cross. No one has ever treated us this way, Elaine. Not even people who doubt it. Not even the sea folk. Most people would step wary if a 10-year-old said she was Aes Sedai. Most people don't really know what an Aes Sedai's face looks like, Nynaeve. I think she went to the tower once. She knows things she couldn't otherwise. Nynaeve snorted, glowering at the back of the woman striding ahead. Satala Annan might have been to the tower 10 times, 100, but she was going to acknowledge Nynaeve Almira as Aes Sedai, and apologize, and learn what it was like to be hauled about by her ear, too. Mistress Anand glanced back, and Nynaeve flashed her a rigid smile, nodded as if her neck was a hinge. Elaine, if these women do know where the bowl is, we don't have to tell Matt how we found it. That was not quite a question. I don't see why, Elaine replied, then dashed all her hopes by adding, but I'll have to ask Avienda to be sure. If she had not thought the Anan woman might abandon them on the spot, Nynaeve would have screamed. The wandering alley gave way to a street, and there was no talking then to amount to anything. The sun's thin rim glared blindingly above the rooftops ahead. Elaine shaded her eyes with one hand very ostentatiously. Nynaeve refused to. It was not that bad. She barely had to squint at all, really. A clear blue sky mocked her weather sense. That still told her a storm was right on top of the city. Even this early, a few brightly lacquered coaches were about in the winding streets, and a double fistful of brighter sedan chairs, 2 or sometimes 4 barefoot bearers in green and red striped vests to each, trotting because they carried passengers, hidden behind the grilled wooden screens. Carts and wagons rumbled over the paving stones, and people began to fill the streets as shop doors opened and awnings went up. Vested apprentices hovering on wagons, and men with great rolled carpets balanced on their shoulders, tumblers and jugglers and musicians readying themselves at likely corners, and hawkers with their trays of pins or ribbons or shabby fruit. The open-sided fish and meat markets had long since been in full cry. All the fishmongers were women, and most of the butchers, too, except those dealing in beef. Dodging through the crowds, past the coaches and sedan chairs and wagons that seemed to think they had no reason to slow, Mistress Anand set a fast pace to make up for interruptions. There were plenty of those. She seemed to be a well-known woman, hailed by shopkeepers and craftsmen and other innkeepers standing in their doorways. The shopkeepers and craftsmen received a few words, a pleasant nod, but she always stopped to chat a moment with the innkeepers. After the first, Nynaeve wished fervently that she would not again. After the second, she prayed for it. After the third, she stared straight ahead and tried in vain not to hear. Elaine's face grew tighter and tighter, colder and colder. Her chin rose till it was a wonder she could see to walk. There was a reason, Nynaeve had to admit grudgingly. In Ebu Dar, someone wearing silk might stroll the length of a square, maybe, but no further. Everybody else in sight wore wool or linen, seldom with much embroidery, except for an occasional beggar who had acquired a cast-off silk garment made on every edge and more whole than cloth. She just wished Mistress Anand had chosen some other explanation for why she was leading the pair of them through the streets. She wished she did not have to listen one more time to a tale of 2 flight girls who spent all their money on fine clothes to impress a man. Matt came out of it well, burn him. A fine young fellow, if Mistress Anand had not been married. A beautiful dancer with just a touch of the rogue. All of the women laughed. Not her or Elaine, though. Not the brainless little honey-kissers. That was the word she used. Nynaeve could guess what it meant. Honey-kissers, penniless from chasing after a man, and their purses full of brass bits and tin to fool fools. Witless loobies, who would have been reduced to beggary or theft had Mistress Anand not known someone who might give them work in the kitchen. She doesn't have to stop at every inn in the city, Nynaeve growled as she stalked away from the stranded goose. 3 broad stories with an innkeeper who wore large garnets at her ears, despite the humble name. Mistress Anand hardly even glanced back to see they followed now. Do you realize we'll never be able to show our own faces in any of those places? I suspect that is exactly the point. Every word out of Elaine's mouth was chipped from ice. Nynaeve, if you sent us running after a wild pig... There was no need to complete the threat. With Brigitte and Avienda to help, and they would, Elaine could make her life miserable until she was satisfied. They will take us right to the bowl, she insisted, flapping her hands to shoo a beggar with a horrible purple scar that obliterated one eye. She could recognize flower paste dyed with blue wort when she saw it. I know they will. Elaine sniffed, in an offensively expressive manner. Nynaeve lost count of the number of bridges they crossed, large and small, with barges poling beneath. The sun climbed its own height above the rooftops, then twice. The Anan woman did not follow even so straight a line as she might have. She really did seem to be going out of her way to find inns, but they continued generally east, and Nynaeve thought they must be nearing the river, when the hazel-eyed woman suddenly rounded on them. "You watch your tongues now. Speak when you're spoken to and not else. You embarrass me, and—" With a final frown and a mutter half under her breath that she was probably making a mistake, she jerked her head for them to follow again to a flat-roofed house right opposite. It was not a large house, 2 stories without one balcony, cracked plaster and brick showing in several places, and hardly in an agreeable location, with the loud rattling of a weaver's looms to one side and the acrid stinks of a dyer's shop to the other. A maid answered the door, though, a graying woman with a square jaw, shoulders like a blacksmith, and a steely eye unsoftened by the sweat on her face. As Nynaeve followed Mistress Anan in, she smiled. Somewhere in that house, a woman was channeling. The square-jawed maid obviously knew Setala Anan on sight, but her reaction was odd. She curtsied with a very real respect, yet she was plainly surprised to see her and obviously doubtful about her being there. She almost fluttered before letting them in. Nynaeve and Elaine were greeted with no ambivalence, though. They were shown to a sitting room 1 flight up, and the maid told them firmly, "Don't stir a toe and don't touch anything, or you'll catch the old what for," then vanished. Nynaeve looked at Elaine. "Nynaeve, one woman channeling doesn't mean—" The field changed, swelling for a moment, then subsiding, lower than before. "Even 2 women doesn't mean anything," Elaine protested, but she sounded doubtful. That was the most ill-mannered maid I've ever seen. She took a tall-backed red chair, and after a moment Nynaeve sat too, but she perched on the edge. From eagerness, not nerves. Not nerves at all. The room was not grand, but the blue and white floor tiles glistened, and the pale green walls looked freshly painted. No trace of gilt showed anywhere, of course, yet fine carving covered the red chairs arrayed along the walls, and several small tables of a darker blue than the tiles. The lamps hanging from sconces were clearly brass, polished till they shone. Carefully arranged evergreen branches filled the swept hearth, and the lintel above the fireplace was carved, not plain stonework. The carving seemed an odd choice, what people around Ebu Dar called the 13 sins. A man with eyes that nearly filled his whole face for envy, a fellow with his tongue hanging to his ankles for gossip, a snarling, sharp-toothed man clutching coins to his chest for greed, and so on. But all in all, it satisfied her very much. Whoever could afford that room could afford fresh plaster outside, and the only reason not to put it up was to keep low, avoiding notice. The maid had left the door open, and suddenly voices coming up the hall drifted through. "I cannot believe you brought them here." The speaker's tone was tight with incredulity and anger. "You know how careful we are, Setala. You know more than you should, and you surely know that." "I'm very sorry, Rihanna," Mr. Sanan answered stiffly. "I suppose I didn't think. I submit myself both to stand surety for these girls' behavior and to your judgment." "Of course not." Rihanna's tone was high with shock now. "That is to say, I mean, you shouldn't have, but... Setala, I apologize for raising my voice. Say you forgive me." "You have no reason to apologize, Rihanna." The innkeeper managed to sound rueful and reluctant at the same time. "I did wrong to bring them." "No, no, Setala. I shouldn't have spoken to you so. Please, you must forgive me. Please do." The Anan woman and Rihanna Corley entered the sitting room, and Nynaeve blinked in surprise. From the exchange, she had expected someone younger than Setala Anan, but Rihanna had hair more gray than not, and a face full of what might have been smile lines, though they were creased in worry now. Why would the older woman humble herself so to the younger, and why would the younger allow it, however half-heartedly? Customs were different here, the light knew. some more different than she liked to think about, yet not this much, surely. Of course, she had never gone very far toward being humble with the women's circle back home, but this, of course, Rihanna could channel. She had expected that, hoped for it anyway, but she had not expected the strength. Rihanna was not as strong as Elaine or even Nicola, burn that wretched girl, but she easily equaled Shiriam, say, or Kwamesa, or Kiruna. Not many women possessed so much strength, and for all she herself bettered it by a fair margin, she was surprised to find it here. The woman must be one of the Wilders. The tower would have found a way to keep its hands on a woman like this if they had to hold her in a novice dress her whole life. Nynaeve rose as they came through the doorway, smoothing her skirts. Not from nervousness, certainly. Certainly not. Oh, but if only this came out right. Rihanna's sharp blue eyes studied the two of them with the air of someone who had just found a pair of pigs in her kitchen, fresh from the sty and dripping mud. She dabbed at her face with a tiny handkerchief, though the interior of the house was cooler than outside. I suppose we'll have to do something with them, she murmured, if they are what they claim. Her voice was quite high even now, musical and almost youthful. As she finished speaking, she gave a small start for some reason, and eyed the innkeeper sideways, which set off another round of Mistress Anand's reluctant apologies and Mistress Corley's flustered attempts to deflect them. In Abu Dar, when folk were truly being polite, apologies back and forth could flow for an hour. Elaine had risen too, wearing a slightly fixed smile. She raised an eyebrow at Nynaeve, cupped her elbow in one hand, and laid a finger against her cheek. Nynaeve cleared her throat. Mistress Corley, my name is Nynaeve Almira, and this is Elaine Trakand. We are looking for... Sitala has told me all about you, the blue-eyed woman cut in ominously. However many gray hairs on her head, Nynaeve suspected she was also hard as a stone fence. Abide with patience, girl, and I'll deal with you directly. She turned back to Sitala, blotting her cheeks with the handkerchief. Barely suppressed diffidence once more tinged her voice. Sitala, if you will please excuse me, I must question these girls, and... Look who is returned after all these years, a short, stout woman in her middle years blurted as she barged into the room, nodding at her companion. Despite her red-belted Ebudari dress and a tanned face that glistened damply, her accents were pure Cairienan. Her equally sweaty companion, in the dark, plainly cut woolens of a merchant, was a head taller, no older than Nynaeve, with dark, tilted eyes, a strongly hooked nose, and a wide mouth. It's Garinia. She... The flow of words terminated abruptly in confusion as the stout woman realized others were present. Rihanna clasped her hands as if in prayer, or perhaps because she wanted to hit someone. Berowin, she said with an edge. One day you will run right off a cliff before you see it under your feet. I am sorry, Blushing, the Cairienan lowered her eyes. The Saldean became intent on fiddling with a circle of red stones pinned at her breast. For Nynaeve's part, she gave Elaine a triumphant look. Both newcomers could channel, and Saidar was still being wielded somewhere in the house. Two more, and while Berowin was not very strong, Garinia stood even above Rihanna. She could match Lelaine or Romanda. Not that that mattered, of course, yet this made at least 5. Elaine's chin set stubbornly, but then she sighed and gave a small nod. Sometimes it took the most incredible effort to convince her of anything. Your name is Garinia? Mistress Anand said slowly, frowning at the woman in question. You look very much like someone I met once. Zaria Alceza. Dark, tilted eyes blinked in surprise. Plucking a lace-trimmed handkerchief from her sleeve, the Saldean merchant touched her cheeks. That is my grandmother's sister's name, she said after a moment. I'm told I favor her strongly. Was she well when you saw her? She forgot her family completely after she went off to become Aes Sedai. Your grandmother's sister. The innkeeper laughed softly. Of course. She was well when I saw her, but that was a long time ago. I was younger than you are now. Rihanna had been hovering at her side, all but grabbing her elbow, and now she leaped in. Satala, I truly am sorry, but I really must ask you to excuse us. You will forgive me not showing you to the door? Mistress Annan made her own apologies, as if she was at fault because the other woman could not escort her down, and departed with a last, very dubious look at Nynaeve and Elaine. Satala, Garinia exclaimed as soon as the innkeeper was gone. That was Satala Annan? How did she... Light of heaven! Even after 70 years, the tower would... Garinia, Mistress Corley said in an extremely sharp tone. Her stare was sharper still, and the Saldaean's face reddened. Since you two are here, we can make up the three for questioning. You girls stay where you are and keep silent. That last was for Nynaeve and Elaine. The other women withdrew to a corner in a huddle and began conversing in soft murmurs. Elaine moved nearer Nynaeve. I did not like being treated as a novice when I was a novice. How long do you intend to continue this farce? Nynaeve hissed at her for quiet. Trying to listen, Elaine, she whispered. Using the power was out of the question, of course. The three would have known on the instant. Fortunately, they wove no barriers, perhaps not knowing how, and sometimes their voices rose just enough. Said they may be wilders, Rihanna said, and shock and revulsion bloomed on the other women's faces. Then we show them the door, Beroin said. The back door. Wilders. I still want to know who this Satala Annan is, Garinia put in. If you can't keep your mind on the straight, Rihanna told her, perhaps you should spend this turn on the farm. Alice knows how to concentrate a mind wonderfully. Now, the words dropped back to a buzz. Another maid appeared, a slender woman, pretty except for a sullen expression, with a rough gray woolen dress and a long white apron. Setting a green lacquered tray on one of the small tables, she surreptitiously wiped her cheeks with a corner of her apron and began fussing with blue glazed cups and a matching teapot. Nynaeve's eyebrows rose. This woman could channel too, if not to any high degree. What was she doing as a servant? Garinia glanced over her shoulder and gave a start. What did Daris do to earn penance? I thought fish would sing the day she cracked a rule, much less broke one. Beroin sniffed loudly, but her reply was barely audible. She wanted to marry. She will advance a turn and go with Carila the day after the Feast of the Half-Moon. That will settle for Master Denal. Perhaps you both wish to hoe the fields for Alice? Rihanna spoke dryly, and the voices fell again. Nynaeve felt a rush of exultation. She did not care much for rules, at least for other people's rules. Other people rarely saw the situation as clearly as she, and thus made stupid rules. Why should that woman Daris not marry if she wished, for example? But rules and penances spoke of a society. Was right. And another thing. She nudged Elaine until the other woman bent her head. Beroin's wearing a red belt, she whispered. That indicated a wise woman, one of Ebudar's fabled healers, their care known far and wide as the next best to being healed by an Aes Sedai, curing just about anything. Supposedly it was all done with herbs and knowledge, but how many wise women have we seen, Elaine? How many could channel? How many were Ebudari, or even Altaran? 7, counting Beroin, was the slow answer. And only one, I was sure, was from here. Ha! The others plainly had not been. Elaine took a deep breath, though she went on softly. None had anywhere near these women's strength, though. At least she had not suggested they were mistaken somehow. All of those wise women had been able. Nynaeve, are you really suggesting that the wise women, all the wise women, are... That would be beyond incredible. Elaine, this city has a guild for the men who sweep the squares every night. I think we've just found the ancient muckety-muck sisterhood of wise women. The stubborn woman shook her head. The tower would have had 100 sisters here years ago, Nynaeve. 200. Anything of the sort would have been squashed flat in short order. Maybe the tower doesn't know, Nynaeve said. Maybe the guild keeps low enough that the tower never thought they were worth troubling. There's no law against channeling if you aren't Aes Sedai, only against claiming to be Aes Sedai or misusing the power, or bringing discredit. That meant doing anything that might possibly cast a bad light on real Aes Sedai should anyone happen to think you were one, which was going pretty
Hey,
far
how
to
you
her way
doing?
of thinking. The real trouble, though, was that she did not believe it. The tower seemed to know everything, and they probably would break up a quilting circle if the women in it could channel. Yet there had
You're
to be
always
some
welcome here, bro.
explanation for...
Well, anyone's welcome
Only
here.
half aware, she felt the true source being embraced, but suddenly she
Just come here
became
to
very aware. Her
chill,
mouth fell open as a
listen
flow
to a
of air
book,
snared her braid right at the base of her skull and ran
do a
her
little
across the
dabbing
room on
or
her toes.
a little bit of
Elaine ran
smoking.
right beside her, red-faced with fury.
Oh, right
The
now
worst of it
it's
was they were both shielded.
5
The
till
short
1,
run ended when they were allowed to settle their heels in front of
so it's
Mistress
almost 1
Corley and the
o'clock.
other two, all three seated against the wall in red chairs, all surrounded by the glow of Saidar. "You were told to be quiet," Rihanna said firmly. "If we decide to help you, you will have to learn that we expect strict obedience no less than the White Tower himself." She only used those last words with a tone of reverence. "I will tell you that you would have been treated more gently if you had not come to us in this irregular fashion." The flow gripping Nynaeve's braid vanished. Elaine tossed her head angrily as she was released. Appalled astonishment became fiery outrage as Nynaeve realized that Barrowin held her shield. Most Aes Sedai she had met stood above Barrowin,
That's
nearly
almost 3
all.
for you.
Gathering
Oh, shit.
herself, she strained to reach the source, expecting the weaves to shatter. She would at least show these women she would not be. The weaves stretched. The round Kyrianan woman smiled, and Nynaeve's face darkened. The shield stretched further, further, bulging like a ball. It would not break. That was impossible. Anyone could block her from the source if they caught her by surprise, of course, and someone weaker could hold the shield once woven, but not this much weaker. And a shield did not bend that far without breaking. It was impossible. "You could burst a blood vessel if you keep at that," Barrowin said, almost companionably. "We do not try to reach above our station, but skills are honed with time, and this was always nearly a talent with me. I could hold one of the Forsaken." Scowling, Nynaeve gave over. She could wait. Since she had no choice, she could. Darris came bearing her tray, distributing cups of dark tea to the three seated women. She never so much as glanced at Nynaeve or Elaine before making a perfect curtsy and returning to her table. "We could have been drinking blueberry tea, Nynaeve," Elaine said, shooting such a look at her that she came close to stepping back. "Maybe it would be best not to wait too long." "Be quiet, girl." Mistress Corley's tone might be calm, but she patted her handkerchief to her face angrily. "Our report of you says you both are froward and contentious, that you chase after men and lie, to which I add that you cannot follow simple instructions, all of which must change if you seek our help. All of it. This is most irregular. Be grateful we're willing to speak to you." "We do help. All of it. This is most... "Seek your help," Nynaeve said. She wished Elaine would stop glaring so. It was worse than the Corley woman's hard stare. Well, as bad, anyway. "We desperately need to find a Turangrial." Rihanna Corley broke in as if she'd been standing there silent. "Usually we know the girls brought to us beforehand, but we must make certain you are what you say. How many doors to the tower library may a novice use, and which?" She took a sip of tea, waiting. "2." The word dripped venom from Elaine's mouth. "The main door to the east when a sister sends her, or the small door at the southwest corner called the novice door when she goes for herself. How long, Nynaeve?" Garinia, who held Elaine's shield, channeled another slender flow of air, not gently. Elaine quivered, then again, and Nynaeve winced,
I'm usually always up
wondering that
late
she
because I
did
have a
not
hard time
grab at the back of
sleeping.
her skirt. A civil tongue is another requirement, Garinia murmured wryly into her cup. That is the right answer, Mistress Corley said, as if nothing else had happened, although she did eye the Saldaean woman briefly over her tea. Now, how many bridges in the water garden? 3, Nynaeve snapped, mainly because she knew. She had not known about the library, having never been a novice. We need to know. Barrowan could not spare anything to channel a flow of air, but Mistress Corley could, and did. Barely keeping her face smooth, Nynaeve knotted her hands in her skirts to hold them still. Elaine had the gall to give her a small, chilly smile. Chilly, but satisfied. A dozen more questions hammered at them, from how many floors the novice quarters contained, 12, to under what circumstances a novice was allowed into the hall of the tower. To carry messages, or to be expelled from the tower for a crime, no others. Hammered without Nynaeve getting in more than 2 words, and those 2 answered silently by the horrible Corley woman. She began to feel like a novice in the hall. They were not allowed to speak a word either. That was one of the few answers she knew, but luckily Elaine responded promptly when she did not. Nynaeve might have done better had they asked about accepted. A little better at least, but it was what a novice should know that interested them. She was just glad Elaine was willing to go along, though by her pale cheeks and raised chin, that could not last much longer. I suppose Nynaeve was really there, Rihanna said finally, exchanging glances with the other 2. If Elaine taught her to pass, I think she would have done a better job. Some people live in perpetual fog. Garinia sniffed, then nodded slowly. Barrowan's nod came entirely too promptly for Nynaeve's liking. Please, she said politely. She could be polite when there was reason, whatever anyone said. We truly need to find the Terangrial the sea folk call the Bowl of the Winds. It's in a dusty old storeroom somewhere in the Rahad, and I think your guild, your circle, must know where. Please help us. 3 suddenly stony faces stared at her. There is no guild, Mistress Corley said coolly. Only a few friends who found no place in the White Tower. Again that reverential tone. And who are foolish enough occasionally to reach out a hand where it's needed. We have no truck with Terangrial or Angreal or Saangreal either. We are not Aes Sedai. Aes Sedai echoed with veneration as well. In any case, you are not here to ask questions. We have more for you, to see how far you've gone, after which you will be taken to the country and given into the care of a friend. She will keep you until we decide what to do next, until we can be sure the sisters are not looking for you. You have a new life ahead of you, a new chance, if you can only let yourselves see it. Whatever held you back in the tower does not apply here, whether a lack of dexterity or fear or anything else. No one will push you to learn or do what you cannot. What you are is sufficient. Now. Enough, Elaine said in a wintry voice. Long enough, Nynaeve. Or do you intend to wait in the country for however long? They do not have it, Nynaeve. Removing her great serpent ring from her belt pouch, she thrust the circle of gold onto her finger. From the way she looked at the seated women, no one would believe her shielded. She was a queen out of patience. She was Aes Sedai to her hair was what she was. I am Elaine Trakand, high seat of House Trakand. I am daughter heir of Andor and Aes Sedai of the Green Aja, and I demand you release me immediately. Nynaeve groaned. Garinia grimaced with disgust, and Barrowan's eyes widened in horror. Rihanna Corley shook her head ruefully, but when she spoke, her voice was iron. I had hoped Satala had changed your mind concerning that particular lie. I know how hard it is to set out proudly for the White Tower, then find yourself faced with returning home to admit failure. But that is never said, even in joke. I made no joke, Elaine said lightly. Snow was light. Garinia leaned forward with a scowl, a flow of air already forming until Mistress Corley raised her hand. And you, Nynaeve? Do you persist in this madness too? Nynaeve filled her lungs. These women had to know where the bowl was. They just had... Nynaeve, Elaine said peevishly. She was not going to let her forget this, even if they did have to effect an escape. She had a way of harping on every little misstep in a manner that cut the ground right from under your feet. I am an Aes Sedai of the Yellow Aja, Nynaeve said wearily. The true
Hey,
Alalin
Shorts, how you
Egwene
doing, bro?
Alvear raised us to the shawl in Salidar. She's no older than Elaine, you must have heard. Not a glimmer of change in those 3 hard faces. She sent us to find the bowl of the winds. With it we can mend the weather. Not a flicker of change. She tried to hold her anger down. She truly did. It just oozed up despite her. You must want that. Look around you. The Dark One is strangling the world. If you have even a hint of where the bowl might be, tell us. Mistress Corley motioned for Derris, who came and took the cups, casting fearful, wide-eyed looks at Nynaeve and Elaine. When she scurried away, out of the room in fact, the 3 women stood slowly, standing like grim magistrates pronouncing sentence. I regret that you will not accept our help, Mistress Corley said coldly. I regret this whole affair. Reaching into her pouch, she pressed 3 silver marks into Nynaeve's hand, and another 3 into Elaine's. These will take you a little way. You can also get something for those dresses, I should think, if not what you paid. Those are hardly suitable garments for a journey. By tomorrow sunrise, you will be gone from Ebudar. We aren't going anywhere, Nynaeve told her. Please, if you know... She might as well have kept silent. The measured flow of words did not slow. At that time we will begin circulating your descriptions, and we will make certain they reach the sisters in the Tarasin Palace. If you are seen after sunrise, we will see that the sisters know where you are, and the White Cloaks as well. Your choice then will be to run, surrender to the sisters, or die. Go, do not return, and you should live long if you give over this repulsive and dangerous ruse. We are done with you. Barrowen, seat them, please. Brushing between them, she went from the room without looking back. Sullenly, Nynaeve let herself be herded down to the front door. A struggle would not achieve anything except maybe being thrown out bodily, but she did not like giving up. She did not. Elaine marched, frozen determination to leave and be done shining in every line of her. In the small entry hall, Nynaeve decided to try once more. Please, Garinia, Barrowen, if you have any hint, tell us. Any clue at all. You must see how important this is. You must. The blindest are those who keep their eyes shut, Elaine quoted, not quite under her breath. Barrowen hesitated, but not Garinia. She put her face right in Nynaeve's. Do you think we're fools, girl? I'll tell you this. If I had my way, we would bundle you out to the farm no matter what you say. A few months of Elise's attentions, and you'd learn to guard your tongue and be grateful for the help you spit on. Nynaeve considered hitting her on the nose. She did not need Saidar to use her fist. Garinia, Barrowen said sharply, apologize. We do not hold anyone against her will, and you know it well. Apologize immediately. And wonder of wonders, the woman who would have stood very close to the top had she been Aes Sedai looked sideways at the woman who would have stood near the bottom, and blushed crimson. I ask forgiveness, Garinia mumbled at Nynaeve. My temper gets the better of me sometimes, and I say what I have no right to. I humbly ask forgiveness. Another sidelong glance at Barrowen, who nodded, producing a sigh of open relief. While Nynaeve was still gaping, the shields were released, and she and Elaine were pushed into the street, the door slamming shut behind them. Chapter 24. The Kin. Incredible, Rihanna thought, watching from a window as the 2 strange girls vanished down the street among the tradesmen and beggars and occasional sedan chairs. She had returned to the meeting room as soon as the pair was escorted from it. She did not know what to make of them, and their persistent claims in the face of all reason were only part of her confusion.
1 second, I'll be
They
right
did
back.
not perspire, Barrowin whispered at her shoulder. Yes? She would have arranged for the news to reach the Tarasin Palace in the next hour if she had not given her word, and if not for the danger. Fear bubbled in her middle, the same panic that had overtaken her after one passage through the silver arches when she went to test for accepted. Just as she had every time it had stirred in the years since, she took a fresh grip on herself. In truth, she did not realize that the fear she might run screaming again had long since conquered any possibility that she would. She prayed that those girls would abandon their insanity. She prayed that if they did not, they were caught far from Ebudar and either kept silent or were not believed. Precautions would have to be taken, safeguards carried out that had not been used in years. Aes Sedai were as near omnipotent as made no difference, though. That she knew in her bones. Eldest, could it be possible that the older of the two really is? We channeled and... Barrowin trailed off miserably, but Rihanna did not need to consider, not even setting aside the younger girl. Why would any Aes Sedai pretend to be less, so much less? Besides, any real Aes Sedai would have put them all on their knees begging mercy, not stood there so submissively. We did not channel in front of an Aes Sedai, she said firmly. We broke no rule. Those rules applied to her as strictly as anyone else. The very first was that they were all one, even those set above for a time. How could it have been otherwise when those who were above must eventually step down? Only through movement and change could they remain hidden. But some of the rumors do mention a girl as Amerlin eldest, and she knew... Rebels! Rihanna put into that all the outraged disbelief she felt, that anyone should dare to rebel against the White Tower. It was hardly strange for unbelievable tales to attach to anyone like that. What about Logain and the Red Aja? Garenia demanded, and Rihanna fixed her with a stare. The woman had gotten herself another cup of tea before coming back up, and she managed to sip defiantly. Whatever the truth, Garenia, it is not our place to criticize anything Aes Sedai might do. Rihanna's mouth tightened. That hardly squared with what she felt toward the rebels, but how could any Aes Sedai do such a thing? The Saldean bent her neck in acquiescence, though, and perhaps to hide the sullen twist of her mouth. Rihanna sighed. She herself had given up dreams of the Green Aja long, long ago, but there were those like Barrowin who believed, secretly they thought, that somehow they might one day return to the White Tower, somehow yet become Aes Sedai. And then there were women like Garenia, almost as poor at keeping their wishes secret, though those wishes were 10 times as forbidden. They actually would have accepted Wilders, and even gone out to find girls who could be taught. Garenia was not done. She always skirted the edges of discipline and frequently stepped over. What of this Satala Anan, then? Those girls know about the circle. The Anan woman must have told them, though how she knows... She shuddered, in a way that would have been entirely too ostentatious for most others, but she had never been able to conceal her emotions, even when she should. Whoever betrayed us to her must be found, and her betrayal punished too. She's an innkeeper. She must be taught to guard her tongue. Barrowin gasped, wide-eyed with shock, and dropped into the chair so hard she nearly bounced. Remember who she is, Garenia, Liana said sharply. If Satala had betrayed us, we would be crawling to Tar Valon, begging forgiveness the whole way. When she first came to Ebudar, she'd been told the story of a woman made to crawl to the White Tower, and nothing she had seen since of Aes Sedai made her question it in the least. She has kept the few secrets she knows from gratitude, and I doubt that has faded. She would have died in her first childbirth if the kin had not helped her. What she knows comes from careless tongues, when it was thought she could not hear, and the owners of those tongues were punished more than 20 years ago. Still, she wished there was some way she could bring herself to ask Satala to be more circumspect. She must have spoken carelessly in front of those girls. The woman bowed her head again, but her mouth was shut stubbornly. At least part of this turn, Rihanna decided, Garenia would spend at the retreat, and she would have special instructions to relay with her own stubborn mouth. Alice seldom required more than a week to make a woman decide stubbornness did not pay. Before she could inform Garinia, though, Darris was curtsying in the doorway, announcing Sarenia Vostovan. As usual, Sarenia stepped right in before Rihanna could say to admit her. In some ways, the strikingly handsome woman made Garinia appear supple, despite keeping the form of every rule exactly.
Let's stick with love.
Rihanna was sure she would have
Love's
worn
love
her
and more
hair in
forgiving.
braids and bells given the choice, and never mind how that would have looked with her red belt. But then, given the choice, she would not have served even one turn. Sarenia did curtsy at the door, of course, and kneel before her, head lowered. But 50 years had not made her forget that she would have been a woman of considerable power had she been able to make herself return home to Arafel. Curtsy and the rest all were concessions. When she spoke in that husky, forceful voice, whether the woman would ever reconcile herself and the problem of Garinia left Rihanna's mind. Callie is dead, eldest sister. Her throat was cut and she apparently had been robbed even of her stockings, but Sumiko says that it was the One Power killed her. That is impossible, Beroin burst out. No kinswoman would do such a thing. Aes Sedai? Garinia said, hesitant for once. But how? The 3 oaths. Sumiko must be wrong. Rihanna raised a hand for silence. Sumiko was never wrong, not in this area. She would have been Yellow Adja had she not broken down completely while testing for the shawl, and although it was forbidden, despite countless penances, she worked to learn more whenever she thought no one was watching. No Aes Sedai could have done this, obviously, and no kinswoman would have, but those girls, so insistent, knowing what they should not. The circle had lasted too long, offered succor to too many women to be destroyed now. This is what must be done, she told them. That flutter of fear began again, but for once she hardly noticed. Nynaeve stalked away from the small house in outrage. It was incredible. Those women did have a guild. She knew they did. Whatever they said, she was sure they knew where the bowl was, too. She would have done whatever was necessary to bring them to tell her. Pretending docility before them for a few hours would have been a deal easier than putting up with Matt Coffin for the light knew how many days. I could have been as acquiescent as they wanted, she thought irritably. They'd have thought I was a pliable old slipper. I could have... That was a lie, and it did not take a foul, remembered taste to convince her. Given half a chance, she would have shaken every one of those women till they told her what she wanted to know. She would have given them Aes Sedai till they squealed. She scowled sideways at Elaine. The other woman seemed lost in thought. Nynaeve wished she did not know what the other woman was thinking about. A wasted morning, and not far short of complete humiliation. She did not like being in the wrong. She was not yet used to admitting she was, really. And now she was going to have to apologize to Elaine. She truly hated apologizing. Well, it would be bad enough back in their rooms. With Brigitta and Avienda still out, it was to be hoped. She was not about to begin in the street, with who knew who streaming by. The throng had thickened, though the sun hardly seemed much higher through the wheeling clouds of seabirds that cried overhead. Finding their way was not easy, after all those twists and turns. Nynaeve had to ask directions half a dozen times, while Elaine stared in another direction, pretending indifference. She stalked across bridges, ducked around wagons and carts, jumped out of the way of racing sedan chairs that wove through the crowds, wished Elaine would say something. Nynaeve knew how to nurse a grudge, and the longer she herself kept silent, the worse it was when she spoke. So the longer Elaine walked without speaking, the darker became the image in her mind of how it was going to be back in their rooms. That made her furious. She had admitted she was wrong, if only to herself. Elaine had no right to make her suffer this way. She began wearing such a face that even people who did not notice their rings gave them a clear path. People who did notice usually seemed to find an urgent need to be a street away. Even some sedan chair bearers skirted around her. How old did Rihanna look to you? Elaine asked suddenly. Nynaeve nearly jumped. They were almost back to Mulhara. 50 years, maybe 60. I don't see it matters. She ran her eyes over the crowd to see if anyone was close enough to hear. A passing hawker, her tray displaying a bitter little yellow fruit called a lemon, tried to swallow her cry in mid-shout when Nynaeve's gaze rested on her for a moment, with the result that she doubled over her tray, coughing and choking. Nynaeve sniffed. The woman probably had been eavesdropping, if not planning to cut a purse. They are a guild, Elaine, and they do know where the bowl is. I just know they do. That was not what she had intended to say at all. If she apologized for dragging Elaine into this now, maybe it would not be so bad. I suppose they are, Elaine said absently. I suppose they might. How is it that she can have aged so? Nynaeve stopped dead in the middle of the street. After all that arguing, after getting them thrown out, she supposed? Well, I suppose she aged the same way as the rest of us, a day at a time. Elaine, if you believed, why did you announce who you were like Rhiannon at the tower? She rather liked that. According to the story, what Queen Rhiannon got was far from what she had wanted. The question did not seem to register with Elaine for all her education. She pulled Nynaeve to one side as a curtained green carriage rumbled past. The street was not very wide there. Over to the front of a seamstress's shop, with a wide doorway showing several dressmakers' forms clothed in half-done dresses. They were not going to tell us anything, Nynaeve, not if you got down on your knees and begged. Nynaeve opened her mouth indignantly, then snapped it shut. She'd never said anything about begging. Anyway, why should she have been the only one? Better any woman at all than Matt Cawthon. Elaine had a fly up her nose, though, and was not to be distracted. Nynaeve, she must have slowed like everyone else. How old is she to look 50 or 60? What are you talking about? Without thinking, Nynaeve noted the location in a corner of her mind. The seamstress's work looked quite good, worth closer examination. She probably doesn't channel any more than she can help, afraid as she is of being mistaken for a sister. She wouldn't have wanted her face too smooth, after all. You never listened in class, did you? Elaine murmured. She saw the plump seamstress beaming in the doorway and drew Nynaeve toward the corner of the building. Considering the amount of lace the seamstress wore on her own dress, the bodice buried in it, and paces of it drooping over her exposed petticoats, she would bear close watching if Nynaeve did order anything. Forget clothes for one moment, Nynaeve. Who is the oldest accepted you remember? She gave Elaine a very level look. The woman made it sound as if she never thought of anything else. And she had too listened, sometimes. Ellen Worrell, I think. She's about my age, I think. Of course, the seamstress's own dress would look fine with a more modest neckline and much less lace, in green silk. Lan liked green, though she certainly was not going to choose her dresses for him. He liked blue as well. Elaine barked such a laugh that Nynaeve wondered whether she had spoken aloud. Coloring fiercely, she tried to explain. She was sure she could, by Beltane, but the other woman gave her no opportunity for a word. Ellen's sister came to visit her just before you first arrived at the tower, Nynaeve. Her younger sister. The woman had gray hair. Well, some of it was. She must have been over 40, Nynaeve. Ellen Worrell was past 40? But what are you saying, Elaine? No one was close enough to listen, and no one seemed to be giving them a second glance, except the still hopeful seamstress. But Elaine lowered her voice to a whisper. We slow, Nynaeve. Somewhere between 20 and 25, we begin aging more slowly. How much depends on how strong we are, but when doesn't. Any woman who can channel does it. Takima said she thought it was the beginning of achieving the ageless look, though I don't think anyone has ever reached that until they've worn the shawl at least a year or two, sometimes 5 or more. Think. You know any sister with gray hair is old, even if you aren't supposed to mention it. So if Rihanna slows, and she must have, how old is she? Nynaeve did not care how old Rihanna was. She wanted to cry. No wonder everyone refused to believe her age. It explained why the women circled back home and looked over her shoulder as if unsure she was old enough to be trusted fully. Achieving a sister's ageless face was all very well, But how long before she had her gray hairs? Blinking, she turned away angrily, and something struck her a glancing blow on the back of the head. Staggering, she rounded on Elaine in astonishment. Why had the woman hit her? Only Elaine lay in a heap, eyes closed and a nasty purple lump rising on her temple. Groggily, Nynaeve fell to her knees and gathered her friend into her arms. "Your friend must be taken ill," a long-nosed woman said, kneeling beside them, careless of a yellow dress that showed far too much bosom, even by Ebudari standards. "Let me help." A tall fellow, hunched in his embroidered silk vest, except for a rather oily grin, bent to take Nynaeve's shoulders. "Here, I have a carriage. We'll take you somewhere more comfortable than a paving stone." "Go away," Nynaeve told them politely. "We don't need your help." The man kept trying to raise her to her feet, though, to guide her toward a red carriage, where a startled-appearing woman in blue beckoned vigorously. The long-nosed woman actually tried to lift Elaine, thanking the man for his help, and chattering how his carriage sounded a fine idea. A crowd of onlookers seemed to have gathered out of air in a semicircle, women murmuring sympathy about fainting from the heat, men offering to help carry the ladies. A scrawny fellow, bold as you please, reached for Nynaeve's purse almost right under her nose. Her head still swam enough to make embracing Saidar difficult, but if all those nattering folk had not fueled her temper, what she saw lying in the street would have. An arrow with a blunt stone head. The one that had grazed her, or the one that had struck Elaine. She channeled, and the scrawny cut-purse doubled over, clutching himself and squealing like a pig in briars. Another flow, and the long-nosed woman fell over backward with a shriek twice as high. The man in the silk vest apparently decided they did not need his help after all, because he turned and ran for the carriage, but she gave him a dose anyway. He out-bellowed any outraged bull as the woman in the carriage hauled him in by his vest. "Thank you, but we don't need any help," Nynaeve shouted, politely. Few remained to hear. Once it became clear that the one power was being used, and folk suddenly leaping about and yelling for no visible cause made it clear enough to most, they hurried elsewhere. The long-nosed woman gathered herself up and actually jumped onto the back of the red carriage, clinging precariously as the dark-vested driver whipped the horses away through the crowd, people leaping aside. Even the cut-purse hobbled off as fast as he could. Nynaeve could not have cared less had the earth opened and swallowed the whole lot. Chest aching, she ran fine flows of wind and water, earth, fire, and spirit mixed and blended through Elaine. It was a simple weave, no bother despite her faint dizziness, and the result let her breathe again. The bruise was not serious. The bones of Elaine's skull were unbroken. Normally, she would have redirected those same flows into much more complex weaves, the healing she had discovered herself. At the moment, simpler weaves were all she could manage, though. With just spirit, wind, and water, she wove the healing that Yellows had used since time immemorial. Elaine's eyes shot open wide, and with a gasp that seemed to take all the air in her, she convulsed like a netted trout, slippered heels drumming on the pavement. That only lasted a moment, of course, but in that moment the bruise shrank and vanished. Nynaeve helped her to her feet, and a woman's hand appeared, holding a pewter cup full of water. "Even an Aes Sedai might be thirsty after that," the seamstress said. Elaine reached for it, but Nynaeve laid fingers on her wrist. "No, thank you." The woman shrugged, and as she turned away, Nynaeve added in a different tone, "Thank you." It seemed to come easier the more you said it. She was not sure she liked that. That ocean of lace heaved as the seamstress shrugged again. "I make dresses for anyone. I can do better for your coloring than that." She vanished back into her shop. Nynaeve frowned after her. "What happened?" Elaine demanded. "Why wouldn't you let me take a drink? I'm thirsty and hungry." With a last frown for the seamstress, Nynaeve bent to pick up the arrow. The other woman needed no explanations. Saidar shone around her in a flash. "Teslin and Jolene?" Nynaeve shook her head. The slight wooziness seemed to be fading. She did not think those two would stoop to this. She did not think so. "What about Rihanna?" she said quietly. The seamstress was back in the doorway, still hopeful. "She might want to make sure we leave. Or worse, maybe Garinia." That was almost as chilling as Teslin and Jolene, and twice as infuriating. Somehow Elaine managed to look pretty while scowling. "Whoever it was, we will settle them. You'll see." The scowl faded. "Nynaeve, if the Circle does know where the bowl is, we can find it, but—" She bit her lip, hesitating. "I only know one way to be sure." Nynaeve nodded slowly, though she would rather have eaten a handful of dirt. Today had seemed so bright for a time, but then it had spiraled into darkness, from Rihanna to— Oh, light! How long before she had her gray hair? "Don't cry, Nynaeve. Matt can't possibly be that bad. He'll find it for us in a few days, I know." Nynaeve only cried harder. Chapter 25. Mind Trap. Moghedien did not want to dream the dream again, but wanting to wake, wanting to scream, did no good. Sleep held her faster than any manacles. The beginning went by quickly, a sketchy blur. No mercy. She would have to relive the rest that much sooner. She barely recognized the woman who entered the tent where she was held prisoner. Halima, secretary to one of these fools who called themselves Aes Sedai. Fools, yet they held her tightly enough by the band of silver metal around her neck, held her and made her obey. Fast movement, though she prayed for slowness. The woman channeled to make a light, and Moghedien saw only the light. It had to be Saidin. Among the living, only the chosen knew how to tap the true power, the power that came from the Dark One. And few were fool enough to, except in direst need. But that was impossible. Blurring quickness. The woman named herself Arangar and called Moghedien by name. She gave summons to the pit of doom and removed the Idam necklace, flinching at pain no woman should have felt. Again, how many times had she done this? Again Moghedien wove a small gateway in the tent. She skimmed to give herself time to think in the endless dark, but no sooner did she step onto her platform, like a small enclosed marble balcony complete with a comfortable chair, than she arrived on the black slopes of Sheol Ghul, forever shrouded in twilight, where vents and tunnels emitted steam and smoke and harsh vapors, and a Myrddraal came to her in its dead black garb, like a slug-white eyeless man, but taller, more massive than any other half-man. It regarded her arrogantly, and gave its odd name unbidden, and commanded her to come. These were not things Myrddraal did with the chosen. Now she screamed in the depths of her mind for the dream to move faster, to blur beyond seeing, beyond knowing. But now, as she followed Shaidar Haran's back into the entrance to the pit of doom, now all flowed at its normal pace, and seemed more real than Tel'aran'rhiod Riyadh or the waking world. Tears leaked from Moghedien's eyes, down cheeks that already glistened. She twitched on her hard pallet, arms and legs jerking as she fought desperately, futilely, to wake. She was no longer aware that she dreamed. All seemed real. But deep memories remained, and in those depths, instinct shrieked and clawed for escape. She was well familiar with the sloping tunnels ceilinged in stone daggers like fangs, the walls glowing with pale light. Many times she had made this downward journey since the day so long ago when she first came to make obeisance to the great Lord and pledge her soul, but never as now, never with her failure known in all its magnitude. Always before she had managed to hide failures even from the great Lord, many times. Things could be done here that could be done nowhere else. Things could happen here that could happen nowhere else. She gave a start as one of the stone fangs brushed her hair, then gathered herself as best she could. Those spikes and blades still cleared the strange, too-tall Myrddraal easily, but though it overtopped her by head and shoulders and more, she was forced to move her head around their points now. Reality was clay to the great lord here, and he often made his displeasure known so.
Cheers, Chris.
A stone tooth struck her shoulder, and she ducked to go under another. There was no longer enough height in the tunnel for her to straighten as she walked. She bent lower, scurrying, crouched in the Murdral's wake, trying to get closer. Its stride never changed, but no matter how quickly she scuttled, the interval between them did not lessen. The ceiling descending, the great lord's fangs to rend traitors and fools, and Mogedion dropped to hands and knees, crawling, then flattened to elbows and knees. Light flared and flickered in the tunnel, cast from the entrance to the pit itself just ahead, and Mogedion slithered on her belly, pulled herself along with her hands, pushed with her feet. Stone points dug at her flesh, caught at her dress. Panting, she wriggled the last distance to the sound of ripping wool. Staring back over her shoulder, she shivered convulsively. Where the tunnel mouth should have been stood a smooth stone wall. Perhaps the great lord had timed it all exactly, and perhaps, had she been slower... The ledge on which she lay projected above a black mottled red lake of molten rock, where flames the size of men danced and died and reappeared. Overhead, the cavern rose roofless through the mountain to a sky where wild clouds raced, striated red and yellow and black, as if on the wings of time themselves. It was not the dark clouded sky seen outside on Sheol Ghul. None of that earned a second glance, and not just because she had seen it many times. The bore into the great lord's place of imprisonment was no closer here than anywhere else in the world, but here she could feel it. Here she could bathe in the radiant glory of the great lord. The true power washed around her, so strong here that attempting to channel it would fry her to a cinder. Not that she had any desire to pay the price elsewhere either. She started to push up to her knees, and something struck her between the shoulder blades, driving her down hard onto the stone ledge, crushing the air from her lungs. Stunned, she struggled for breath, then stared back up over her shoulder. The Murdral stood with one massive boot planted firmly on her back. Almost she embraced Saidar, though channeling here without express permission was a good way to die. The arrogance on the slopes above was one thing, but this... "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I am Mogedion." That eyeless gaze watched her as it might an insect. She'd often seen Murdral look at ordinary humans that way. "Mogedion." That voice inside her head flushed away all thought of the Murdral. It nearly flushed away all thought. Beside this, any human lover's deepest embrace was a drop of water beside the ocean. "How deep is your failure, Mogedion? The chosen are always the strongest, but you let yourself be captured. You taught those who would oppose me, Mogedion." Eyelids fluttering, she fought for coherence. "Great lord, I taught them only small things, and I fought them as I could. I taught them a supposed way to detect a man channeling." She managed to laugh. "Practicing it gives them such headaches they cannot channel for hours." Silence. Perhaps as well. They had given up trying to learn that long before her rescue, but the great lord did not need to know that. "Great lord, you know how I have served you. I serve in the shadows, and your enemies never feel my bite until my venom is working." She did not quite dare say she had deliberately let herself be captured to work from within, but she could suggest. "Great lord, you know how many of your enemies I brought down in the war of power, from the shadows, unseen, or if seen, ignored, because I could not possibly be a threat." Silence. And then, "My chosen are always the strongest. My hand moves." That voice reverberating in her skull turned her bones to boiling honey and her brain to fire. The Murdral had her chin in its hand, forcing her head up before her vision cleared enough to see the knife in its other hand. All her dreams were to end here in a slit throat, her body going to feed the target. Perhaps Shaidar Haran would say the choice cut for itself. Perhaps... No. She knew she was going to die, but this Murdral would not eat one shred of her. She reached to embrace Saidar, and her eyes bulged. There was nothing there. Nothing. It was as if she had been severed, She knew she had not. It was said that tearing was the deepest pain anyone could know, beyond any power to deaden. But in those stunned moments, the murderer forced her mouth open, scraped the blade along her tongue, then nicked her ear. And as it straightened with her blood and saliva, she knew, even before it produced what appeared to be a tiny, fragile cage of gold wire and crystal. Some things could only be done here, some only to those who could channel, and she had brought a number of men and women for this very purpose. "No," she breathed. Her eyes could not leave the Cour Souvre. "No, not me. Not me." Ignoring her, Shida Haran scraped the fluids from the knife onto the Cour Souvre. The crystal turned a milky white at the first setting. With a flick of its wrist, it tossed the mind trap out over the lake of molten stone for the second. The golden crystal cage arched through the air and suddenly stopped, floating at the very spot where it seemed the bore was, the place where the pattern lay thinnest of all. Moghedien forgot the murderer. She flung out her hands toward the bore. "Mercy, great lord!" She had never noticed that the great lord of the dark possessed any mercy, but had she been bound in a cell with rabid wolves, or with a Darath in Mult, she would have begged the same. In the right circumstances, you begged even for the impossible. The Cour Souvre hung in mid-air, turning slowly, glittering in the light of leaping fires below. "I have served you with all my heart, great lord. I beg mercy. I beg mercy." "You may serve me still." The voice flung her into ecstasy beyond knowing, but at the same instant the sparkling mind trap suddenly glowed like the sun, and in the midst of rapture she knew pain as if she had been immersed in the fiery lake. They blended, and she howled, thrashing like a mad thing, thrashing in endless pain, endless, until after ages, after nothing remained but agony and the memory of agony, the tiny mercy of darkness overwhelmed her. Moghedien stirred on the pallet. "Not again, please." She barely recognized the woman who entered the tent where she was held prisoner. "Please," she shrieked in the depths of her mind. The woman channeled to make a light, and Moghedien saw only the light. Deep in sleep she quivered, vibrating from head to toe. "Please." The woman named herself Arangar and called Moghedien by name. She gave summons to the pit of doom, and "Wake, woman," said a voice like rotted bone crumbling, and Moghedien's eyes popped open. She almost wished for the dream back. No door or window broke the featureless stone walls of her small prison, and there were no glow bulbs or even lamps, but light came from somewhere. She did not know how many days she had been there, only that tasteless food appeared at irregular intervals, that the single bucket serving for sanitation was emptied at even more irregular times, and soap and a bucket of perfumed water were somehow left for her to clean herself. She was not sure whether that was a mercy or not. The glad thrill at seeing a bucket of water reminded her how far she had fallen. Shaidar Haran was in the cell with her now. Hurriedly rolling from her pallet, she knelt and put her face to the bare stone floor. She had always done whatever was necessary for survival, and the murderer had been all too glad to teach her what was necessary. "I greet you eagerly, Myakova." The lashed-together title burned on her tongue. "One who owns me," it meant, or simply, "my owner." The strange shield Shaidar Haran had used on her, Myrdral could not, but it did. The shield was not in evidence, yet she did not consider channeling. The true power was denied her, of course. That could be drawn only with the great lord's blessing. But the source tantalized, though the glow just beyond sight seemed somehow odd. She still did not consider it. Every time the Myrdral visited, it displayed her mind trap. Channeling too near your own Cour Souvre was extremely painful. The nearer, the more the pain. This close, she did not think she would survive a simple touch on the source. and that was the least of the mind trap's dangers. Shaidar Haran chuckled, a rasp of dried, cracked leather. That was another difference about this Myrddraal. Far more cruel than Trollocs, who were merely bloodthirsty, Myrddraal were cold and dispassionate in it. Shaidar Haran often showed amusement, though. So far she felt lucky to have only bruises. Most women would have been on the brink of madness by now, if not beyond. "And are you eager to obey?" that rustling, grating voice asked. "Yes, I am eager to obey, Nyakova," whatever was necessary to survive. But she still gasped when cold fingers suddenly tangled in her hair. She scrambled to her feet on her own as much as possible, but still was hauled up. At least this time her feet remained on the floor. The Myrddraal studied her, expressionless. Remembering past visits, it required an effort not to flinch or scream, or simply reach for Saidar and make an end. "Close your eyes," it told her, "and keep them closed until you are commanded to open them." Moghedien's eyes snapped shut. One of Shaidar Haran's lessons had been instant obedience. Besides, with her eyes closed, she could try to pretend that she was somewhere else, whatever was necessary. Abruptly, the hand in her hair rushed her forward, and she screamed in spite of herself. The Myrddraal meant to run against the wall. Her hands went up for protection, and Shaidar Haran released her. She staggered at least 10 steps, but her cell was not 10 paces corner to corner. Wood smoke. She smelled a faint touch of wood smoke. She kept her eyelids firmly closed, though. She meant to continue with no more than bruises, and as few bruises as possible for as long as she could manage. "You can look now," a deep voice said. She did, cautiously. The speaker was a tall, broad-shouldered young man in black boots and breeches and a flowing white shirt unlaced at the top, who watched her with startlingly blue eyes from a deep, cushioned armchair in front of a marble fireplace, where flames danced along long logs. She stood in a wood-paneled room that might have belonged to a wealthy merchant or noble of moderate rank in this time, the furniture lightly carved and touched with gilt, the rugs woven in red and gold arabesques. She did not doubt it was somewhere close by Sheol Ghul, though. It did not have the feel of Tel Iran Riod, the only other possibility. Swiveling her head hastily, she drew a deep breath. The Myrddraal was nowhere to be seen. Tight bands of quande seemed to vanish from around her chest. "Did you enjoy your time in the vacuole?" Moghedien felt icy fingers dig into her scalp. She was no researcher or maker, but she knew that word. She did not even think to ask how a young man of this time did, too. Sometimes there were bubbles in the pattern, though someone like Masana would say that was too simple an explanation. Vacuoles could be entered if you knew how, and manipulated much like the rest of the world. Researchers had often done great experiments in vacuoles, so she vaguely remembered hearing. But they were outside the pattern, really, and sometimes they closed up, or perhaps broke off and drifted away. Even Masana could not say what happened, except that anything in them at the time was gone forever. "How long?" She was surprised her voice was so steady. She rounded on the young man who sat there showing her white teeth. "I said how long? Or don't you know?" "I saw you arrive." He paused, lifting a silver goblet from the table beside his chair, eyes smiling at her over the rim as he drank. "The night before last." She could not hide a relieved gasp. The only reason anyone would want to enter a vacuole was that time flowed differently there, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, sometimes much faster. She would not have been entirely surprised to learn that the great Lord had imprisoned her for 100 years, or even to emerge into a world already his, to make her way feeding among carrion, while the other chosen stood at the pinnacle. She was still one of the chosen, in her own mind at least, until the great Lord himself said she was not. She had never heard of anyone being released once a mind trap was set, but she would find a way. There was always a way for those who were cautious, while those fell who called caution cowardice. She herself had carried a few of that so-called brave sort to Sheol Ghoul to be fitted with Corsouvre. Suddenly it occurred to her that this fellow knew a great deal for a friend of the dark, especially one not many years past 20. He swung one leg over an arm of the chair, lounging insolently under her scrutiny. Grendel might have snatched him, if he had any position or power. Only too strong a chin kept him from being pretty enough. She did not think she had ever seen eyes so blue. With his insolence in her very face and what she had had to endure at Shaidar Haran's hands so fresh, with the source calling her and the Murdral gone, she considered teaching this young friend of the dark a sharp lesson. The fact that her clothes were grimy added their part. She herself smelled faintly of the perfume in the wash-water, but she had had no way to clean the rough woolen dress in which she fled Egwene Alvir, with its rips from her journey down to the pit. Prudence prevailed. This room must be close to Sheol Ghoul, but barely. "What is your name?" she demanded. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" "Yes, I do, Mogedion. You may call me Moradin." Mogedion gasped. Not for the name, any fool could call himself Death, but a tiny black fleck, just large enough to see, floated straight across one of those blue eyes and then across the other in the same line. This Moradin had tapped into the true power, and more than once, much more. She knew that some men who could channel survived in this time aside from Althor. This fellow was much of a size with Althor, but she had not expected the great lord to allow one that particular honor. An honor with a bite, as any of the chosen knew. In the long run, the true power was far more addictive than the one power. A strong will could hold down the desire to draw more Saidar or Saidin, but she herself did not believe the will existed strong enough to resist the true power, not once the Sa appeared in your eyes. The final price was different, but no less terrible. "You have been given distinction greater than you know," she told him. As though her filthy dress was the finest strife, she took the armchair opposite him. "Bring me some of that wine, and I will tell you. Only 29 others have ever been granted." To her shock, he laughed. "You misapprehend, Mogedion. You still serve the great lord, but not quite as you once did. The time for playing your own games has passed. If you had not managed to do some good by accident, you would be dead now." "I am one of the chosen, boy," she said, fury burning through caution. She sat up straight, facing him with all the knowledge of an age that made his little different from times of mud huts. As much of that knowledge as she had anyway, and in some areas concerning the one power, no one outstripped her. She almost embraced the source, no matter how close Sheol Ghoul lay. "Your mother probably used my name to frighten you not so many years gone, but know that grown men who could crumple you like a rag sweated when they heard it. You will watch your tongue with me." He reached into the open neck of his shirt, and her own tongue clove to the roof of her mouth, her eyes fixed on the small cage of gold wire and blood-red crystal that he drew out, dangling on a cord. She thought vaguely that he tucked another just like it back in, but she had eyes only for her own. It definitely was hers. His thumb stroked, and she felt that caress across her mind, her soul. Breaking a mind trap did not require much more pressure than he was using. She could be on the other side of the world or farther, and it would not matter a hair. The part of her that was her would be separated. She would still see with her eyes and hear with her ears, taste what crossed her tongue and feel what touched her, but helpless within an automaton that was utterly obedient to whoever held the Corsouvre. Whether or not there was any way to get free of it, a mind trap was just what its name implied. She could feel the blood draining from her face. "You understand now?" he said. "You still serve the great lord, but now it will be by doing as I say." "I understand, Miakova," she said automatically. Again he laughed, a deep, rich sound that mocked her as he put the mind trap away beneath his shirt. There is no need for that. Now you've had your lesson. I will call you Mogedion, and you will call me Moradin. You are still one of the chosen. Who is there to replace you? Yes, of course, Moradrin, she said tonelessly. Whatever he said, she knew that she was owned. Chapter 26. The Irrevocable Words. Morghese lay awake, staring at the ceiling through the moonlit dark.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this stream for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.